Someone left it on the windowsill. That is what the first officer at the scene noted, a single cigarette, stubbed out on the painted wood of the sill of the back bedroom window in the house at 14 Crestwood Lane in Milford, Ohio, on the morning of August 19th, 1957. Not inside, not outside. Balanced on the exterior ledge, half smoked, as if someone had set it down carefully before climbing through. The officer wrote it in his notebook. A detective photographed it. A technician bagged it, sealed it, marked it with the case number, and sent it to the county evidence room in a paper envelope. The case number was 1957 CR 0441. The case would go unsolved for 67 years. What happened in that bedroom on the night of August 18, 1957, would define one family for 3 generations. A wound passed down through the years, like an inheritance no one wanted, but no one could refuse. And it would take a retired schoolteacher writing letters to a state cold case unit, a 26-year-old lab analyst who had not yet been born when the crime occurred, and a cigarette in a paper envelope that had somehow survived 6 decades of bureaucratic near misses to finally answer the question that Milford, Ohio had lived with longer than almost anyone could now remember. But before any of that, we have to go back to that August. Because to understand what was finally uncovered in 2024, you first have to understand who lived at 14 Crestwood Lane and what the people of Milford lost the night that window was opened from the outside. Milford sat in the Miami Valley of southwestern Ohio, a town of 11,000 in the summer of 1957. Built around a canning factory, a small college, and a main street that still had 2 5 and dime stores operating side by side because the town was large enough for both and loyal enough to support neither closing. The post-war years had been good to Milford. New houses had gone up on the east side of town throughout the early 1950s. Modest ranch homes and small 2-stories on streets with names like Crestwood and Elmwood and Birchwood, because the developer had a fondness for trees and an agreement with the lumber yard. Young families moved in. Children filled the sidewalks on summer evenings. The smell of cut grass and charcoal hung over the neighborhood on weekends, and the sound of baseball games on portable radios drifted from open windows from April through October. It was the kind of neighborhood that existed in its pure form for only a handful of years before life complicated it. And 1957 was still inside those years. Drive-in theaters anchored the edge of town. The soda fountain at Merritt's Pharmacy was the social center for anyone under 20. Families gathered around their televisions on Sunday evenings for Ed Sullivan. And the news, when it was bad, which in 1957 it sometimes was, felt distant enough that Crestwood Lane could still feel safe. Dorothy Pauline Feehan was 41 years old that August. She had moved to Milford in 1947, the year she married Gerald Feehan, an estimator at the canning factory who was quiet and steady, and who had a gift for crossword puzzles and a genuine inability to throw anything away that might someday be useful. They had 3 children: Patricia, 15, Robert, 11, and the youngest, Carol Ann, who had just turned 8 and who was known in the neighborhood primarily for her laugh and her willingness to climb any tree on the street. Dorothy worked part-time at the college library 4 mornings a week, a position she had held for 6 years and that she regarded, her daughter Patricia would later say, with something close to reverence. She loved the order of it. She loved the quiet. She loved being somewhere that gathered knowledge and kept it safe. She was a woman of precise habits and warm instincts, the kind of neighbor who noticed when a porch light had been on 3 mornings in a row and knocked on the door to check. She baked a coffee cake every Friday morning and often left half of it on a neighbor's porch without knocking, because she understood that accepting help was sometimes easier when no one was watching you do it. She kept a kitchen garden behind the house, tomatoes, beans, one ambitious row of corn that usually lost its argument with the local raccoons. She attended Mass at St. Anthony's on Sunday mornings with Gerald, and on Sunday afternoons, she graded the library's new acquisitions against a running list she kept in a small leather notebook, marking the ones she intended to read herself with a tiny penciled star. The Feehan house on Crestwood Lane was the kind of house that looked like what it was. Lived in, maintained, the paint fresh enough and the gutters clear enough that you could tell someone cared. A bird bath in the side yard that Dorothy filled every morning. A metal glider on the front porch where, on warm evenings, she and Gerald would sit after the children were in bed and talk about nothing in particular. Which is one of the things that long marriages accumulate and that no one thinks to document until it's gone. On the evening of August 18th, a Sunday, Dorothy had made a pot roast that Gerald said was the best she'd made all year. Patricia had done the dishes without being asked, which Dorothy noticed and did not take for granted. Robert had gone to bed early because he had a cold and had spent most of the day on the living room couch, irritable and warm. Carol Ann had fallen asleep on the living room floor watching television, some variety program that had held her attention just long enough to lose it. And Gerald had carried her upstairs at 9 o'clock and tucked her in. Dorothy had sat in the kitchen for a while after, reading a library book and listening to the radio, the way she did on warm nights when she didn't want the day to end. The radio was tuned to a Cincinnati station. The book was a mystery novel. The kitchen windows were open to the August air. Gerald Feehan went to bed at 10:15. He would later tell investigators he had heard nothing unusual in the night. That was the last ordinary evening at 14 Crestwood Lane. It was Patricia who found her mother at 6:40 the following morning. Patricia had come downstairs to make coffee before the others woke, as she sometimes did that summer, practicing at being grown. The kitchen was empty. The library book was closed on the table. She called for her mother once, then again. She went down the hall. The bedroom door was ajar. She did not go in. She went back to the kitchen and called the Milford police from the telephone on the wall. The dispatcher noted the call at 6:44 a.m. Officers arrived at 14 Crestwood Lane at 6:52 a.m. Gerald Feehan was awake by then. The children were in the kitchen. The responding officer noted in his report that the back bedroom window was unlocked and raised approximately 8 inches. The screen had been removed and was propped against the exterior wall of the house. On the windowsill, balanced on the painted wood, was a cigarette, half-smoked. Stubbed out carefully, the way a person stubs out a cigarette when they intend to come back to it. Nobody came back to it. Dorothy Feehan had died sometime in the night. The manner of death was determined within 24 hours. The cause, deliberate. The window was the point of entry. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere else on the property. Whoever had raised that window had known it would be unlocked, or had tested it carefully enough to find out. The investigation was assigned to Detective Howard Sills of the Milford Police Department. He was 34 years old, a Korean War veteran who had joined the department in 1952. Sills worked the case with a focus and intensity that his colleagues would remember decades later. He requested the cigarette be processed by the State Crime Lab. In 1957, what could be done with a cigarette butt was limited. Fingerprinting, if the surface cooperated, which the painted sill did not. Chemical analysis of the tobacco, which told him the brand, Lucky Strike, but nothing about the person who had smoked it. The cigarette was catalogued, sealed, and archived. It contained everything needed to identify its owner. In 1957, there was no way to know that. Sills built a suspect picture from the neighborhood. A man who had been seen walking slowly along Crestwood Lane on 2 evenings in the week before the 18th, described by 3 separate residents as someone they didn't recognize. Medium height, light-colored short-sleeved shirt. He had stopped once in front of the Feehan house and appeared to look at it before continuing. No one had thought enough of it to say anything at the time. Afterward, they all remembered. A name surfaced within the first 2 weeks. Raymond Birch, a 29-year-old man who worked at the canning factory alongside Gerald Feehan, and who had a prior arrest, not a conviction, but an arrest, for an incident involving a woman in a neighboring county in 1954. The arrest had been expunged from the formal record, but not from the memory of anyone who worked at the factory at the time. Sills interviewed Birch twice. He was unable to confirm where Birch had been on the night of August 18th. Birch said he'd been home. No one could confirm or refute it. In 1957, that was often the end of the road. Gerald Feehan cooperated fully with the investigation. He submitted to multiple interviews. He took a polygraph, which was less reliable than investigators believed at the time, and which returned results described as inconclusive. He was never charged. He was, in the estimation of the people who knew him and the investigators who spent hours with him, a man in genuine and obliterating grief. He resigned from the canning factory in 1958 and moved with the children to his sister's home in Dayton. He did not return to Milford. The house at 14 Crestwood Lane was sold in 1959 to a young couple who did not know its history until their next-door neighbor told them, and who lived there for 30 years and raised 3 children of their own in rooms that had once held a family's worst night. Detective Howard Sills never stopped working the case, within the limits of what working a cold case meant in 1958, 1962, 1970. He kept a folder. He reread it when something occurred to him. He died in 1981, having never gotten an answer. His widow donated his personal case notes to the Milford Historical Society in 1989, where they sat in an archival box alongside photographs of the town's first fire station and the original charter of the Milford Rotary Club. The Feehan children grew up in the shadow of August 19, 1957, each in their own way. Patricia became a high school English teacher in Dayton, married in 1964, raised 2 daughters, and for most of her adult life did not speak about her mother to people who hadn't known her. Not because she had healed, but because she had learned that talking about it without resolution was its own kind of re-injury. She kept one photograph on her bureau. Dorothy at the kitchen table, laughing at something behind the camera, a coffee cup in her hand. Patricia died in 2019 at the age of 77, without an answer. Robert became a plumber, then a contractor, then a man who called the Milford Police Department every few years for no reason he could ever fully articulate, except that he felt he owed it to someone. He was polite about it. He understood that cases went cold, that priorities shifted, that the people who had worked the original investigation were dead. He called anyway. Carol Ann was 8 years old on August 19, 1957. She had slept through it. Her father had tucked her in at 9 o'clock, and she had woken up to a world in which her mother was gone. And she had spent the next 67 years holding that discontinuity in the center of herself like a stone she couldn't put down. She became a school teacher, kindergarten, for 31 years, in Columbus. She retired in 2001. She started writing letters. The letters went to the Milford Police Department, the Ohio State Police Cold Case Unit, the State Attorney General's office, her state representative, and eventually to a nonprofit organization called Justice Preserved that advocated for forensic review of historical evidence in unsolved cases. Carol Ann Feehan, Carol Ann Doster by marriage, though she had been widowed in 2009, wrote careful, specific, unemotional letters. She was a retired kindergarten teacher. She understood that what you wanted did not always arrive when you needed it, and that the correct response was patience and repetition, not desperation. She wrote the same essential letter, updated with new addressees and new developments in forensic technology, for over 20 years. Robert, for his part, had done something practical with his grief. In 1991, 34 years after the night on Crestwood Lane, he had driven back to Milford for the first time since his family left. He had parked on Crestwood Lane and sat in his truck looking at the house for about 20 minutes. New shutters, different curtains, a basketball hoop in the driveway that hadn't been there in 1957. He drove away without getting out of the truck. He called the Milford police the following week. By 1997, Detective Howard Sills had been dead for 16 years. The officers who had worked the original scene were all dead or retired. When Robert called the department that year, the officer who answered had to look up the case number. He told Robert they hadn't had any new leads. Robert thanked him. He said he would call again. He did. In 2019, the Ohio State Police Cold Case Unit, under a new director who had made it a priority to reprocess archived biological evidence using updated forensic technology, flagged case 1957 CR 0441 for review. The cigarette butt, 62 years old, in its original paper evidence envelope, which had been transferred from the Milford Evidence Room to State Archives during a facility consolidation in 1988, was sent to the State Forensic Lab in Columbus. The lab could not immediately extract a usable profile. The degradation after 6 decades was extensive. The cigarette went into a secondary queue for a newer extraction process, developed in cooperation with a university forensics program that could recover partial profiles from heavily degraded biological material. It sat in that queue for 3 years. In 2022, a 26-year-old forensic analyst named Mara Chen ran the secondary extraction. She had been 14 years old in the year the cigarette was first flagged for review. She was not alive in 1957. She had no personal memory of anything the case file described. What she had was a process, a result, and a partial DNA profile that was strong enough to upload to a forensic genealogy database. She uploaded it in November 2022, and she waited. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, cross-checking archives, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like these, take a second to like this video and subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now let's get back to Dorothy. The match alert came in February 2024. Mara Chen was at her desk on a Tuesday morning, working through a different case file, when the genealogy database flagged a familial connection to the 1957 CR 0441 profile. She set down what she was doing. She built the family tree outward from the partial match, a process that takes hours when the connection is distant. Cross-referencing branches against geography, against age, against gender, narrowing and narrowing until the candidates reduced to one. It took her most of the day. She called cold case detective Rachel Okafor of the Ohio State Police at 4:47 p.m. "I have a name," she said, "and I need you to sit down." The name was Warren Dale Pruitt. He had been born in Milford in 1925. He had grown up 4 blocks from Crestwood Lane. He had worked for 11 years between 1948 and 1959 at the same canning factory as Gerald Feehan, though in a different department, on a different shift, with only the kind of peripheral acquaintance that develops between men who nod at each other in the parking lot. He had smoked Lucky Strikes. He had left Milford in 1959, 2 months after the Feehans sold the house and relocated to Dayton, and moved to Cincinnati, where he had lived for the remainder of his life. He had married in 1961. He had 2 children and 5 grandchildren. Warren Dale Pruitt had died in 2017 at the age of 91. There would be no trial, no arrest, no moment in a courtroom where the truth was formally confirmed before a jury. What there would be was DNA. Investigators obtained a sample through one of Pruitt's surviving adult children, who consented to provide it when investigators explained what they were trying to confirm. The adult child sat with that request for 4 days before agreeing. They have not spoken publicly about what those 4 days were like. The sample went to Mara Chen's lab. The result came back in 3 weeks. Warren Dale Pruitt's DNA matched the cigarette butt from the windowsill at 14 Crestwood Lane. The cigarette he had stubbed out carefully before climbing through Dorothy Feehan's back window on the night of August 18, 1957. Set down like something he was coming back for, had waited 67 years to say his name. Carol Ann Doster was 84 years old when Detective Okafor called her in March 2024. She was living in an assisted living facility in Columbus, in a room that her family said she had made very much her own. Plants on the windowsill, a handmade quilt on the bed, a framed photograph of her mother on the bureau that she had carried from house to house for 77 years. Carol Ann listened to Detective Okafor's explanation without interrupting. At the end, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Does my brother know?" Okafor told her they were calling him next. Carol Ann said, "Good. He's been waiting longer than anybody." Robert Feehan was 88 years old. He was living in Dayton, in the house he'd owned for 40 years. He answered the phone himself. Warren Pruitt had lived 58 years after that August night, long enough to marry, to become a father, to become a grandfather, to be remembered by his family as an ordinary man. Long enough that, by the time the technology existed to find him, he was beyond the reach of a courtroom. What he was not beyond was the record. The Ohio Attorney General's office issued a formal press release in April 2024, naming Warren Dale Pruitt as the individual whose DNA matched the evidence in case 1957 CR 0441. His name is now permanently attached to what he did. His family has not spoken publicly. The record has. Dorothy Pauline Feehan was 41 years old. She had made the best pot roast of the year that Sunday. She had sat in the kitchen she loved, reading a library book, listening to the radio, not wanting the day to end. She had a daughter who would become a teacher, a son who would call the police every few years for 67 years just to make sure someone still knew her name, and a youngest child who was 8 years old the morning the world changed and who spent the rest of her long life writing careful, patient letters on her mother's behalf. The cigarette on the windowsill was not something Pruitt forgot. It was something he chose to leave, and then chose to leave behind. The way people leave behind the evidence of themselves in moments they believe will be forgotten. He was wrong. The paper envelope held. The archive survived. The technology arrived. And a 26-year-old analyst who was not alive in 1957 ran a process on a degraded sample and found, in the chemistry of an old man's DNA, the answer that a family had been owed for 67 years. Some things, it turns out, do not degrade entirely. Not the evidence, not the grief, not the daughters who keep the photograph on the bureau and the sons who keep making the calls. What do you think justice means when the person responsible dies before an answer arrives? Is a name in a press release enough? Or does justice require something more? What does it say about how we treat cold cases that a retired kindergarten teacher's letters over 20 years mattered as much as any official investigation? And what would it mean if every paper envelope in every evidence room in the country were finally opened? Leave your answer in the comments. We read everyone. Justice found Dorothy Feehan after 67 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe that truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.